Of today's session. Well, welcome, Brian, or Dr. Lovins. If you don't know Brian, Brian is a principal for Justice System Partners, which is also where I work. He earned his PhD in criminology from the University of Cincinnati. He was the president-elect for APPA. He was the assistant director before at Harris County, probation and parole. He also was like the co-director at the University of Cincinnati's center with Dr. Latessa, the research center with Dr. Latessa. The man has literally done everything imaginable under the sun, I feel like. The other day, he was like doing presentations for people in Morocco. And he also just won the DCS Practitioner of the Year award. So Brian really is just, I like to call him a Renaissance man, right? So somebody who just like really can do it all. And what I love about Brian's journey in his story, and I'm not just saying these things because he pays my bills via my income and salary, but also because I think it's just truly amazing that he's able to have parlayed a very traditional degree into something that really knows no bounds. And I think that's something that we really want to emphasize as part of the series is that, yes, you can take your PhD and become a professor. You could take it and go to a traditional research shop outside of a university setting. You can also take it and do crazy amounts of creative things with it that we just haven't even thought about. And so I'm really excited for Brian to join us and kind of talk about all the crazy things he's doing with his PhD. So welcome, Brian. So, we kind of started this saying that you've worked in all of these different spaces, and we talk about spaces in the all out market being things like a university research space or a local agency space or a federal space, a state space, an advocacy, international development, for example, and you've worked in a lot of them. So can you kind of talk us through kind of your journey from where you began and kind of through each of those different spaces?
Yeah, I think so. And thank you, Shan, Kate. I appreciate the invitation and thank you guys for joining the conversation. While it feels like forever ago, it was just, I think now 8 years ago or 9 years ago, I was in your space as finishing up my PhD. Granted, you probably had a little bit better path. I took 11 years to finish it. So I was like on the I was on the COVID plan of getting a dissertation before COVID was cool. So I appreciate that. But it's interesting looking backwards because the truth is like how I got into my undergrad, my master's degree, my PhD was not some major plan that like, can I be a principal at a not-for-profit 24 years from now? Like, I literally was like, no clue what I was going to do. The way I picked my undergrad degree was I crossed off everything that I knew I didn't want to do. And the only thing left was sociology and anthropology. And the only reason that was left because I didn't know what the hell it was. So, and for you younger folks, that was like before the internet. So you couldn't just look shit up, right? You had to go to the library and get a dictionary and all that stuff, or encyclopedia. And so I really didn't know. So I became a soc undergrad. I wanted to go to law school. I was about 8 hours into my undergrad and realized that law school was not going to be the path for me. It just wasn't. Like, it was different than high school was. And I'm sure all of you guys felt that same way. And then it kind of, like, I started to think about and critically think about the world and about our place in the world. And so I really started to want to work in a helping field, and really started to think about, like, what can I do? And so I finished up my undergrad and got a master's in social work. And so my master's is, I'm a trained social worker. I worked as an independent licensed social worker for 10, 15 years before going back to get my PhD. And so I had lots of experiences. I had 7 jobs in 7 years. One of the beauties of non-academic world is you can transfer really quickly to jobs. If you don't like it or it's something that you don't like, it's not a lifetime investment where you're moving across the country. And signing up and buying a house or a written apartment. And then after 1 year, like, yeah, these guys are assholes. I don't want to be here. And you sort of get trapped. And then, then it's like, well, why are you bouncing from job to job? So, I had the luxury of having 7 jobs in 7 years and really starting to dig in and watch what we do in the field of corrections. And so I knew from a very early time I wanted to work. Like my first job was with youth who engaged in sex crimes, who had to go to residential facilities. Like these were some kids that were really struggling with behavioral kind of stuff and behavioral health, and recognizing, I think early on that I had a special gift to be able to see people who did really bad stuff and still see them as human beings. And I think that's what it takes to help people get better. And so I always stayed in the field, right? I always stayed in practitioner kind of world. Even when I went and got my master's, I got my PhD. I worked the first 2 years full time and went to classes full time and had a GA position full time. And so I worked like 90 hours a week, and luckily, like my wife, so I'm married to Lori Lovins, who's a PhD criminologist as well. And we actually went back to the University of Cincinnati together to get our PhDs. So unlike most who meet their future spouse while at the university, we brought ours with us. And so, so that was a different experience. But I think one of the interesting things since I was 25 was I've never applied for a job. I've had 7 jobs and never once did I apply for one. I've always been asked to apply or recruited to come on, and just had the job, including getting into the doctorate program. And the reason why I believe, and maybe not true, like this is my own thinking on this, and happy to have folks give me different feedback about it, but I think it's because I'm passionate about what I do wherever I stand. Mm-hmm. And I try to do my best work. I'm not ever trying to look for the next job. I'm always just really trying to do my job really well. And I think people are attracted to that kind of ability of like not wanting someone else's work, but being okay with where you sit. And like, so I was okay with being a graduate student for 11 years. I was okay working at the Corrections Institute for 11 years while getting my PhD and not having to worry about like, well, what's next? Mm-hmm. Right? I just spent my time doing what I love to do and helping things improve. And then people see that and they're attracted to it. And so out of my PhD program, my now good friend, Dr. Teresa May, who's the director of Harris County, was in Dallas. And there was a big scandal in Harris County around drug testing. And they were giving drug tests to people or getting results back from people who were not theirs. And some people ended up going to prison or got revoked. And one of the elements they got revoked on was a faulty drug test. Mm-hmm. And so they fired the entire administration, and Teresa applied and got the job. Now she's another one, right? A PhD in psychology, but doesn't really work in the academic field. And unusual, right? As I look around and I see both male, female, they on the call, like being top of a corrections facility or corrections department as a female is a unique place. If you look across the country, lots of line staff and lots of mid-management folks, but generally the directors are men. And so I think it was a really awesome experience to work under her and to develop my skills under her as well. But she called and said, I need you to come to Harris and help me clean it up. And I said, we don't know each other very well. I just want to be really clear. Like, I've never been a probation officer. I've never wanted to be a probation officer. And I'm not real sure that probation actually works. And her response was, that's why I want you here, was because you haven't been it and you bring different perspectives and challenging the status quo of the system. and you're going to challenge all of us to think differently about what we do. And that's how I became the assistant director of an 850 person agency with 38,000 people being supervised at any given time, and a host of connections and interactions with criminal justice system or the justice system, was because I challenged the status quo and thought about the field differently. And so I think that was an interesting piece. And then, right, and what I would say is in that space, and I know we'll talk about this in a bit, but it was interesting because what I found was that my PhD helped, but didn't, it helped some credibility stuff. It helped the way I critically thought, but it didn't really prepare me to be a employer of 850 people. That was a different skill set that I had to learn. And so I had to dig back in. I had to be willing to understand, if I really wanted to help transform the system, I had to understand how organizations operated. In my PhD, so UC, we had dual tracks. Mine was in corrections and systems. And so under the systems stuff, we talked a little bit about the criminal justice system, but not really organizational systems and how to help transform them. So I cut my teeth for 7 years on how to get employees, or how to develop an agency that allows for their staff to do their best work. And I think that's important as we go through that. We recognize we don't have all the answers, and that, you know, our PhDs prepare us for thinking, but not necessarily for content, and that we're always going to need to expand our skill sets to be able to do other jobs. And I think from there, I established myself. I ran for the American Probation and Parole Association president, and so I got elected by that group. And so one of the first academics, now one of the first people outside of applied work. Now that I run a not-for-profit organization that has been the president of the organization as it's going forward. And so I think that's a unique opportunity that we can talk a little bit about. And the reality is, I think what I've probably done in reflecting back, what I've done is I've created a place where we can talk about research in a really practical way that translates it to understanding of the field. And part of why I can understand that is because I've worked in the field. I have a sense of it. I sat with people. I wasn't an ivory tower administrator. I went out to the field, sat with people. Even as an assistant director of 850 employees, I held a caseload of 1 at any given time because I wanted to make sure that I knew what I was asking the staff to do and what was practical and doable for them.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things two of the things that I take away from your story is that, one, we're not all as lucky. Some of us have to apply to our jobs. But really, it's this story about allowing the doors to open as they do, and then walking through them when that time is right? Like, as opposed to having such a strict plan of checking the boxes, right? My mom asked, like, what are you going to do with that degree? Where are you going next? How is that working? Right. And instead of, listening to my mom's ideas of like where I needed to go next, right? This idea of really just allowing yourself to be a part of the journey and to lean into what you're doing in the moment, and to take the next moment to do the next thing when that happens, and just to kind of take this really non-linear path. I think that's one of the things I hear. The other thing I hear about it is this idea of really being able to take what you know from concept thinking in your PhD and apply it, but to do so in a way that's really grounded in the work itself, right? So the idea that you took a caseload of 1 just to make sure that you're not asking people to do something you can't do. And I think why that's important is that then as an academic, when we're doing research and we have to offer practical recommendations as researchers, right? You have a better idea of what is actually practical or not, right? I could list of 5,000 things like I think you should do with my findings, but what your sense is now you've done it, and so you can say, no, that's not it. You think it's practical from an ivory tower standpoint, but it's actually not that practical. And so thinking through that, how do you, for students who don't necessarily have the on the ground work or aren't yet an assistant director of a major probation agency to be able to take a caseload, how do you encourage people then to get that kind of practical experience to really contextualize the work that they're doing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there are all sorts of different paths. I think some of us got lucky and got into schools that have applied tracks, right? So UC under Ed and colleagues has been an incredible force of changing the field. Your experience with Fay at George Mason, same thing, right? Like there are other universities, as I'm sure there's people here that don't have, someone in their department that's ever met someone within the criminal justice system, but they write about it and they research it. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I know criminologists who have over 400 publications and have never, ever stepped in the foot of a prison or in the foot of a probation department or even met someone on probation or on supervision. And so I think there are all sorts of different ways to do that. I never took I knew from the very beginning that the only way I was going to get to an academic route, and so this is part of, I think, the journey for me. The only way I was going to get to an academic route was if it was through a research position, not a. And I like teaching. It's not that. I think though that that I've always wanted to better the system, and I feel like that's where my passion is helping people figure out ways to improve the system. But you have to know the system. So even if there's not a faculty member or an interest within your university for applied work, and that it's not, that space just isn't acceptable, I think there are all sorts of ways, right? There's, so I know like Shannon, you and Jen had, you guys got NIJ grants or, right, Apple BJA grants to work in a space there, right? So helping contextualize it within that. I think there's always, right, student kind of driven grants, small number grants. There's always work with and consulting. And so, we hire, for example, at JSP, we hire consultants to do research stuff under supervision. And so, you could look to expand out. I think, to be honest, you can do some free work, which there are agencies all over the country who don't have the budgets or the support to do anything or understand it, but they want to do better. And so starting to think about like, who can I partner with and how do I find inroads to this? And so like reaching out and having colleagues who know this space connect you up with people. I get people call all the time, like, I got $3,000. What can you do? And I say, we can hold a meeting, right? But as a grad student, I think those are opportunities. And so making sure that you're connected. I know, for example, with APPA, a student membership is $25 a year. And there is an entire community of research and technology. And there's always people posting about ideas or about what if. And so I just had a conversation the other day with a person who runs victim impact panels for DUI. And it kind of laid out the research. And they're like, well, we'd love to research this stuff, right? You could be on those listservs and say, hey, I don't have the expertise, but I'm happy to dig in and try to figure this out and start a conversation with people about what you could do with them or for them to help them understand their stuff. And then it's data. And then you get published, right? The other thing I would say is while I've worked in the field, I've ensured that, or I've really tried to publish in both academic and non-academic alt academic outlets, and that I want, like, so I publish in federal probation multiple times so that people have access to it. It's not behind a paywall. But published also on the other side in criminal justice and behavior and those days, right? And so I think making sure that we're taking paths. And one of the things I really like, Shannon and Jen work for JSP with me. One of the things from their practice that I really liked was always taking opportunities to develop and build something while you're doing something else. And I think that's an important skill to have as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that point is well heard too about, when we were doing our, JSP held a convening last week with correctional administrators and treatment providers about implementing MOUD or medication for opioid use disorder in corrections. And in my panel that I was facilitating, we were talking about the logistics of how to do that. And some of the concern was about staffing and what were some solutions. And one of the solutions we were talking about was a manpower analysis. And one of the participants said, "Oh, there's no one in our department who can do that. Like, we don't have the resources to do a manpower analysis." And my first inclination said, "Cool. Contact a local university. There is a PhD student or a master's student who has the skills to do that, and they will do it for you." And then, everyone furiously, wrote that down. Oh, that's a great idea, right? And so I think that there is so much space, to your point, of cold calling agencies and saying, "I need help. I'm finishing my PhD. I can do this work. Here are the skills. What kind of questions do you have that align with mine? How can I help you answer them? How can I help you and you help me?" Right? I think there's so much space for that I don't think we really talk about enough. So I think your point is well heard of reaching out and doing that. And I think practitioners are hungry for that kind of help too. And a lot of that can parlay itself then into more and bigger work and full-time work too.
That's right. That's right. And there's also, there's, like I said, there are agencies as well, right? They're not agencies as in practitioner side, but agencies in like ours and others, right? So I used to do a ton of consulting work on the side when prior to getting to Harris, and then even at Harris a little bit on the side with research organizations, right? And so because they needed some contract work and they needed to buy some hours to do a validation study or to do an analysis. And so I think the hard part sometimes, though, is knowing how to do that stuff, right? It's like, okay, that makes sense, but I'm not trained to do applied work. I'm trained to do theoretical work. And so I think ensuring that you're tying with mentors and finding and reaching out to people outside of your university if you're not in an applied space, and making sure that you're picking their brain, right? Like for us, like I'm happy to have a conversation with folks. I'm happy to bring folks along. I've done some like pro bono PI work for people that like got a grant for $12,000 but don't know how to get started and moving forward, and helping them like frame it up and answer research questions and then talk through the data. It's a couple hours here and there, but I think those kind of opportunities and making sure that you're finding people that are experienced and interested in applied work is important to tie to them and start to build your 5 people of your professional network kind of stuff.
Totally. I think one of the other things that you said that I definitely want to come back to is this idea, right, that you publish both in translational spaces or practitioner friendly spaces and academic spaces. I think there's this perception, at least I think in our department, that, publishing only happens if you're at a university setting, which is not possibly true. And that, there's no sense. I had a faculty member say to me as I was working on a paper with them, "Oh, well, you're in AltAc space, like you don't need this publication," right? And I remember saying to this person immediately, "I need this publication just like everyone else," right? The publication helps me stay legitimate as a researcher. It helps me provide credit to JSP that we're actively publishing. It helps me, parlay back into a university setting if I wanted to later, but that you can do that work simultaneously, that we think we're operating in individual sandboxes, but in fact, we can be in both boxes at the same time, playing in both boxes at the same time. And I think one of the ways you do that is you publish in practitioner, you go to academic conferences, you go to practitioner conferences, you do both of the things. And I think they both play into each other and help your thinking on both sides too, right?
I agree. I 100% agree. And I think what's nice about publishing in academic journals is they keep you grounded in theory, and they make sure that, it's peer reviewed. And so you have to logically make your argument, or at least in most settings and most journals with most reviewers, although sometimes I think they're a bit illogical when they read it, but regardless. But it forces you to think in a different way than maybe a practitioner journal. But I think having both, right? So the last couple of years, rethinking the way that probation and parole officers orient themselves, right? And so it all came out of theoretical models that I've now, so I have this concept, right, of ref coach, and that probation officers or organizations try to design staff around this, or their organization around this referee model, where people have rules and they apply them and they blow the whistle, versus coaches who help people change. And that I recently wrote a book chapter, and I thought through, like, where did that get born out of? And it was born out of Lipsky's Street Level Bureaucracy book I read, published in 1980, and a book I read in 2002, right? And I've been iterating on that thinking now for, what is that?
A few
18 years, right? And we published the article in 18, so 16 years of percolating this like theory underneath that I saw in practice. And where it came up was this, right? Like the way that it bubbled up was, I was talking to officers, and they were basically saying there's no reason to reward people for doing what they're expected to do. I'm not going to say thank you for walking in. I'm not going to reinforce them for behavioral change. The expectation is that they change and follow the rules. And my job here is to basically write them up and potentially send them to prison if they aren't compliant. And what I started to think about was, like, that sounds just like a referee, right? They're not invested in the game. They don't provide reinforcers to people when they do great work. They only call out the stuff that's problematic. And that all comes out of Lipsky's work. Mm-hmm. And so I think really being grounded in theory, but not living in theory, is important. And that being able to contextualize behavior and see it as you move forward, I think, is one way to really start to be good at translating our work to practice.
Well, and so that leads us to kind of this other question that I have too, is that, we talk a lot about translational work and being in a space that translates, the research into practice. But for you, two things. What do you consider then translational work, right? Because separately, I've heard some pushback that considering it translational work is offensive is too harsh of a word, but sitting in that space, right? That this idea that, we have to translate it or dumb it down to practitioners as opposed to professionalizing the space and bringing them up, right? So I don't know that I agree with that. I think that's just something I've been percolating and like sitting with recently. But, for you, what does translational work look like? And then for students that are in their programs who are trying to become translational researchers, like what are good translational skills? Like when somebody is really good at translating research, what does that look like?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And you're right. Like, I don't see translational work as dumbing it down. Yeah, I see it as grounding it in practicality. Sure. Right. And I'll give you an example where in my experience and my work, I jacked up two big things. Like, I've made billion mistakes, and I've screwed up 100,000 things. But my two biggest probably organization or system regrets are, one is risk assessment. So I've done and validated and created lots of risk assessments, and I should have done it the opposite way, right? And thinking about grounding it in reality and grounding it in practice, knowing our field and knowing our risk averseness, I should have written it. I should have thought about it more and not just done the work, and actually thought about what it looked like afterwards. And what I should have done instead of, and I'm sure all you guys are familiar with risk assessments, how they operate, right? Most of them low, moderate, high risk to reoffend. You get proportional kind of relative risk failure rates on each of those categories. What I should have done was oriented them the opposite direction. What I should have said was, these folks at the end of this assessment, as we collected all this information on, 90% of these folks are going to be successful. 75% of these folks are going to be successful with a little bit of support, and 50% of these folks are going to be successful without support. Mm-hmm. And if we can support them, we can help them become more successful. And what we've done is create an entire industry of trying to keep people from failing and focusing on failure and risk averse behavior versus success and growing change. And so that one I should have been more contextualized and really thought about what that looks like, and not adopted what previous academicians have done to develop it, but actually thought about how does this get applied and the way it should have been.
Sure.
Right. The second one is case planning. And I created a framework that is academic as hell. Right. And so I created this case planning module for UC that is, 12 states have been trained on. And every time I see it, I apologize and tell them to stop doing it right now. And they're like, no, this is evidence-based practice. And I say, no, I made this shit up. So don't pretend like it's evidence-based practice. It was academic practice, right? So we created this case plan that goal, objective, technique, and then you track all these things, and then somehow some probation officer is going to sit down with someone on supervision and write out 3 goals and 6 objectives and 15 techniques ahead of time, and they know what they're going to do with someone 7 months from now. And the reality is people in applied spaces don't know what they're going to do with the person 7 minutes from now.
Yeah.
Right? They don't know what's going to come in the door. They don't know what space that person's in. They don't know what skills they have. They don't know what happened just before they walked in the door. And to think that we're going to focus on some altruistic kind of piece of risk assessment or needs, like, we've got to contextualize it to them and help them see how it's going to help their life. And so you got to kind of take what, right? And so I created this really, all that to say, I created this really academic document that now has been adopted by the field. And so what it translates to is people just filling in the boxes and completing it, and then setting it aside, putting it in a folder, and then working with the person, and it doesn't really connect.
Sure. So
translational work to me is theoretical work, not dumbed down, but grounded in practice, right? And another one that you'll see in corrections is fidelity monitoring, right? It's so bastardized by academics. It's like, yes, you have to be true to a model, but there's nothing says you have to read word for word from a curriculum. No one's getting better if I read them a bedtime story in treatment. And how they get better is applying the concepts of core correctional practice or cognitive behavioral interventions and applying them so that people can think about their behavior, learn new skills, practice them, get better at them, get acknowledged for getting better at them, and continuing to iterate more and more and more on those skills. And as an academician working in practitioner world, we've got to help people translate it to usable practice. And I think that's for me where it's not dumbing it down. It's really, how do we develop tools that actually work within the system.
And so then thinking of that and thinking about it from a student lens, then do you have any ideas about then how students can start to develop those skills now, so that way when they're on the market or they're in jobs, right, that they're not developing those skills then, right, that they're not connecting that then, that they're able to start working on those things now?
That's hard. It's hard, especially when you're not in a practitioner friendly space at the university. I think the same path, right? Having opportunities, internships, free work, connecting, work part-time in the field, shadow stuff, right? We have to start hearing and listening to the people that do the work to best understand and contextualize it.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that practitioners have all the answers, because they don't. They struggle just as much the other way in translating their work to practitioner or to academicians and helping them understand what they do. I think there is a part with like being in that space and just being an ethnographist and like listening and looking and thinking and what is this about and how does it work. I think the other piece, though, is reading practitioner-based journals, right? And I think you get a feeling for it based on what people are writing about, where in our academic worlds, we're criminology and public policy comes out, and we're grabbing and saying, okay, which one of these articles, helps me deliver my stuff. But you got to be on the federal probation stuff too. And APPA has a journal that's free, Perspectives. And right, we've got to be reading things and involving ourselves in more applied writings as well. And I think that would help too.
Totally. One thing you said that I don't want us to gloss over, because I love a good opportunity to shamelessly plug qualitative research, is this idea, as somebody who is a quantitative researcher, is this idea that there is value in ethnography and true qualitative work, not just in theory building, but in contextualizing quantitative data. Right, that if you practice ethnography or practice participant observations or systematic social observation or these more qualitative skills in real applied settings, that it makes you a better quantitative researcher also. And so I don't want to take any moment for granted to shamelessly plug how those things are connected and to talk about how qualitative research is so important to the process. And I think also important to applied work, right? Because we think a lot of applied work sometimes as evaluation work too. And really understanding that the two are they have to operate together.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I would highly recommend, and this is where, so a couple of things. One, most correction, unless you're going to a big state department, you want to work at the state level corrections department, you're going to be just about the only person in your agency that understands data, right? So you're going to go work. So Harris County, for example, 850 employees. We had a research director when I got there. Wasn't incredibly, he was, his background was in health, didn't understand corrections and theoretical work. He used to work for the CDC and did kind of tracking of diseases kind of research and that piece. And so never did applied work, never really understood how to look at outcomes. And so if I was the research director, if that was my position there and I was taking that spot, there was no one there to help guide my work, right? The probation directors don't understand research. They don't understand data. They don't understand how to use, like the buzzword now is data driven, but they don't really understand what that looks like and what it means. They put up a graph and they claim to be data driven, and they're going to ask you guys to do things. They don't know what they're asking. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that your experience is incredibly important in helping agencies do their work, and don't sell yourself short in the interviews and the hiring process. Don't bring light to the fact that you've not run a research project, right? Or that you don't know applied work, right? Because they don't know your space. And too many people I've seen when we've hired will come in and like downplay their skill set, and they'll describe themselves and they won't articulate what they can provide to an agency. And so one of the things I would highly recommend is, as you are moving through wherever you are in your stage or space within your system, is to start digging into data visualization. There is an incredible dearth of employees, researchers, practitioners who do not understand, or who understand how to really look at data and help influence practice. And the better you can visualize, right? So I've worked, so one of our contracts is with a couple agencies across the country who basically, my job is for me to get on a call with them once a week, and they show me the charts that they're getting ready to send out to their people, and I tell them that all the stupid shit they got in it that's going to cause them problems. Right? And I tell them, I said, look, you put that out, you're going to get 50,000 calls, because what you mean isn't what you're presenting there. And people are going to interpret this wrong. And then you're going to have to backtrack and you're going to have to get in front of a judge or an elected official and apologize that that's not what it was intended, right? These are super smart people who understand data. They just don't understand how to visualize it for folks that they can understand it and it gets their message across. So one of the skill sets that I would tell you that I would be looking for if I was in charge of an agency that does practical work is the ability to take information, right? Because that's what they got. They have data, right? They have information. They don't have understanding. Be able to take that and develop it into digestible content that helps people improve their job.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Well, I love the call to visual data and visual messaging. You know that I hate the way that a Word document looks, or general academic presentations drive me crazy. I once turned my background black at ASC and got 5,000 compliments because I had a black background, right? So just like thinking differently about the way we present information, I think is important to me. I know it's important to you. And I think I hadn't really considered that as like a skill, but I think you're right. So practicing as often as possible, taking your findings, turning them into an infographic. One of the things that I've been hearing lately now is two things is one, doing small, like 1 to 2 minute videos of your findings for your papers and uploading them to YouTube or sharing them or Twitter, right? So as a way of dissemination, but to practice easy translation, right? It's 1 or 2 minute elevator speech of your paper. So that's one way to think about that. And then 2, creating infographics or visual messages of your findings, and that being your Twitter post as like your, hey, look at what I published, here's the main finding, right? Or working through that. And I think that those are skills that I think are really important, and even practicing them at ASC, right? Like ditch the idea that you have to put bullet points as your findings and think through a graphic that you could use instead.
Or don't go to ASC and come to APPA and
yes.
Or do both.
Or do both. I was going to say, or do both. Exactly. So that brings me to like another good point, right? So your conversation is, one, for hiring purposes, and some folks are on the market, some folks are soon to be on the market, some folks don't even want to think about the market yet. But as people are preparing, you've done a lot of hiring, both at UC, at Harris, and at JSP. I imagine, although I don't know, but I imagine that what you're looking for might vary by that space. And so can you talk us through, if at all it varies, like how that varies, and then what you're looking for out of people in each of the different spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. So it 100% varies. It varies depending on funding streams. And so I'm sure like most of us know kind of how funding works, but most of the research space is soft money, right? So it's, can you deliver and can you continue to deliver on contracts, and you got to continue to bring in money to get paid. Agency work is different, right? That's an agency invests in your position to help them do their work better or improve something or look at their data, whatever that is. And so that's usually, salary based and it's not contingent on funding. Although in some places you'll get a 2-year post because there's a grant that needs an internal investigator or action research team person, and they don't have anyone to get the money. And so they hire someone to cover it. But for the most part, agencies, those are embedded research positions that are on fixed money or fixed salaries. So working in an academic space that is non-faculty, I think has, to be honest, and I struggle with this one because I appreciate my friends at UC and the folks that work in that space. I think that is a hard place to work as a researcher only, because most research positions are 40-hour full year positions. They're not they're not faculty positions. You don't have the flexibility that your colleagues have with summers off and comp pay and all of that, versus you're working on soft money and 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. And so that one's a little harder for me to kind of like lean into. Although important, I think universities give us lots of backgrounds and lots of capacity.
Sure.
Harris County, there's obviously a range of positions. There's applied work, right? Where not applied research, but like probation officer and supervisor and manager and assistant directors like myself. But there were also quality improvement people. There were data research analyst people. There were research director people, and each position varied as well. In that space, what I realized very quickly was, even though I had applied skills, my job was not to be a research director over a research director. And so I ended up having to find people who could do the job with very little oversight and with an hour conversation once a couple weeks to put them on a path. And then they were go-getters. They were self-starters. They developed research projects within our organization. They investigated things and learned things and helped translate research to practice and innovated, and right, with some guidance, but not a whole lot of direction. I think so that's one difference, right? So if you don't feel like you have a lot of skills yet, or a lot of confidence, then I would look for agencies that have infrastructure to move up within and not be the only person by yourself, right? Because it's a lonely island when there's no one there. And eventually someone's going to be like, what are we paying you to do? And they don't know what to tell you. They just are going to say, we want you to do, like we hired you to do something. One of the tricks that I had that I learned very quickly that you may end up having to do, that we did in our last round of hiring, was we actually scrubbed a data set and sent it to the applicants, our last 5 applicants, and said, you need to answer these 2 questions with this data set and provide a 20-minute presentation that would be applicable to people who work in the field.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why was because prior to that, and not Shannon was not our reason. So Shannon, this doesn't apply to you, but I have made hires before where they said, oh, I understand how to do this. And they could speak the language. They knew how to run logistic regression. They knew how to control for risk. They knew how to do X, Y, or Z. They said they worked with practitioners, but when we brought them on board, their skill set was not to the level we needed, and we didn't have the infrastructure to help support them to get better.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they just floundered at their position and ultimately either left or we had to terminate them because they just couldn't meet the expectations of the position. And so really thinking about and being, as all academics can, self-critical of your skills and say, look, what do I need to be successful? And can I go to a space where I'm the only person? Or do I need infrastructure to help me grow my skills? And then select agencies that you may have to come in at a lower pay, but select agencies where you can come in at an analyst position or a mid-level position and not someone at the top, even though with a PhD, you're going to be academically above many of the people that work beside you.
Yeah. One thing that I think this offers to me is a really good opportunity for the questions that you ask at the end of the interview, right? So we sometimes talk about like, what are some questions that you ask at the end? I always say that my questions were, can you describe kind of the culture of what it looks like to work at your organization, or what does creativity look like for you, right? Like that was really important to me for finding a home to work in. And maybe one of the questions is, what kind of infrastructure of support can you provide to researchers, right? And that might actually help folks understand, okay, if my quant skills aren't as good, can I lean on a Jen to help me figure it out, right? Do I have a Kate here who's going to help me work through these problems, or am I going to be on YouTube, refreshing my brain about doing something that I haven't done in a long time, right? So I think that one of the takeaways I hear too is not only thinking about your own skills and evaluating them in relative to the market, but then also asking questions of the company and the people that you're interviewing with, like, what does a structure of support look like here, to help people make informed decisions if that's ultimately where they want to be. I do want to take a minute though. Lily, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on, you were talking about being the only scholar in the room, so to speak, which is the experience I'm currently kind of having, or I'm part of a group, but I'm working with probation officers and with some activists on some probation reform. And I've been finding it to be really frustrating because they say they have all these things they want me to do and study. And I say, yes, I will definitely study that. Like they really care about race. And I'm like, I care about race. This is great. I did all these selection models. I did Heckman models. I did imputation, logistic regression, survival analysis, like every kind of thing you can do, which I can't explain to them. But I came in and I didn't try to explain. I said, here's the results. And it shows, yes, there's this racial disparity, but it's nuanced. It's worse in this one area. It's worse for felony probation than for misdemeanor probation, and so on. And they weren't happy. And it's so frustrating because what they said was, well, your results are, your racial differences are different in these two groups. Shouldn't they be the same? Like it's either a problem or it isn't. They really hate that nuance. And also they really wanted me to say straight up, like race is causing this problem and this is why, which as a researcher, I'm hesitant to ever use causal language at all. And so I guess what's the line or balance between being assertive and convincing with your research, but also having integrity and vigor in your research? Because it seems like they kind of just want me to find what they already have decided in some cases.
No, that's a pretty good summary, I'm sure, of 98% of my conversations across my experience, my history, right? Like 100%. People have opinions and they want you to validate them. I'm having the same conversation with a contract we have around risk assessment, and I'm basically saying, look, it's valid. The risk assessment's clearly valid. It predicts. It just doesn't predict for this one subpopulation, which kills the model under some circumstances. And so I show them all the iterations of all the ways that it's predictive. And then I say, look, but it's not predictive of this population. And their answer is, well, then it must not be predictive and we got to get rid of it. And it's like, no, that's not what I said. What I said is it's right. And exactly literally what you had, which like, they're just like, is it predictive or not? And I'll say, yes, but with caveats. Oh, Alyssa, just wait, Shannon. Oh no, Shannon's not at home. Her cat will show us her butt in the thing. So
I do not have a very demure cat.
She'll expose herself all over the camera. So I'm surprised my kids haven't come in and introduced themselves. It's like the new Zoom trick. But I think I think what we can't do is convince people with data that their belief system is not reflective of what we find in the data, right? We know this by crime statistics. We know that people are more scared. 2 years ago, people were more scared than ever, and it was like the safest year in the country for most people, right? But again, you got to contextualize that. It's not safe for people of color in these geographic spaces under this blah, 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 right? So it's like there was violence spiking in places, but overall going down, and the people that should have been not scared weren't, right? So I think people are informed, but they also have their own kind of contextual experience that they have to fight against. So I generally stand on the side of like, here's my findings. You guys, like, I can't control what you do with it. I can't control that you own it. The problem is when they pay you to do it. So I usually try to stay ahead of the game. And I will say, like, if I'm doing an evaluation, I'm going to say, look, my evaluation is my evaluation. Like, you are hiring me for my expertise in this. And it may not be exactly what you think it's what you want to be. I understand you're all well-intentioned and you have great ideas. And so here are the caveats, but it is what it is. And I think it's easier to do when you have 20 years of experience and like people see your past work, and it's harder to do early on.
Yeah.
And especially with passion around diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of stuff.
I appreciate your answer, but it's not very helpful though. You're just telling me this is a problem I'm always going to have. I don't like that.
Yeah. So what I've done, so to answer that a little bit better, then one of the things I've really found that practitioners understand is converting like logistic regression to predicted probabilities. Right? Because and you can control for a whole bunch of shit behind the predicted probabilities that you don't have to explain too much, right? It's like, well, the predicted probability of X is, and it gives them they understand that language versus, models. And they're not, I can tell you this right now, you walk in and tell them that their work is racist in some areas, or at least disparate in some, or you walk in and tell them it's not. It doesn't matter if you're the expert in the room, they're still going to argue with you.
Yeah, I actually do use predictive probabilities. The problem is that they go, well, it could be because of this other thing. And I'll say, well, I controlled for that. And they'll like, oh, but that's part of the thing with the race. And it's like, well, yes, but I controlled for it.
Right.
Yeah. So they don't.
Yeah.
I find, and I don't know if I feel like I'm a conspiracy theorist here. I want to know if you feel this way about the field, but I've been looking at a lot of these jobs. I recently got one, but I've been looking at them, and a lot of jobs, particularly for police work, but also for just general justice institutions, a lot of more activist groups, they'll say they want someone who does pretty advanced statistical analysis, someone who will do data collection, who will create data, who can use R and SAS and data and so on. And then it'll say they want someone with at least a bachelor's degree, preferred master's degree. And so other people are nodding here that they're seeing this too. And I find this really confusing because I don't think anyone with a bachelor's degree, or I'd be very surprised if any of them have the experience listed in these jobs. And I kind of feel like I need to put in these, like, you know, my cover letter, like, you don't think you need me, but you need me, you know, or you need other people with this level of experience and you're not asking for it. And part of me thinks they don't want someone who's good. They want someone who will do what they say or will show results the way they want them to be shown. And I don't know if
they just don't want to pay someone with a PhD.
So what'd you say, Nelly?
I said, or they just don't want to pay someone with a PhD.
Yeah.
Which is what I think is the driver behind it.
I mean, a lot of the ones for police
are you pointing at me? I don't want to pay someone.
No, I'm pointing in my, you're to the left on my squares, on my Brady Bunch squares. Nilly is to the right. I very much agree. And, you know, Lily, I think this is an interesting conversation, and it's actually one that we talk about, but a little bit in reverse. I think in this group, what we tell folks is that you're going to see that a lot and apply for it because you will likely be the most qualified person in the room. I think Nilly's commentary about paying, it is what it is, right? So you walk into these settings where they don't want to actually pay you for a PhD. And so, you know, they have this like kind of caveat. I think the other thing we want to be thoughtful about is kind of just this idea that actually having those qualifications actually provides more equity in the applicant process, right? So fewer people have access for lots of systemic reasons to getting a PhD, but could still have the skills necessary, right? I mean, my aunt worked for Boeing.
Maybe.
So she worked for Boeing for a year. She retired from Boeing, having been the lead engineer for the presidential helicopter, and she has an AA degree, right? And so I think, you know, it allows people to still have those skills that you just develop over time, right? Based upon experiences that you've collected, and not necessarily requiring someone to have a formidable PhD education. But then that means that when you have those skills and a PhD education, then you get to walk in usually with a leg up and hopefully being able to say, like, you know, to leverage it to actually get more money, right? But I think your conversation about those applications is important. And I think it is challenging and I think it is confusing, but I think it's one of those ways then that you say, these are all the things I can offer you in addition to these baseline skills, like these technical skills. The other thing that my PhD offers is theoretical grounding that a bachelor's and a master's degree just possibly cannot provide, right? And then that becomes...
They don't seem to want that. They don't like the theory stuff in my experience with these jobs. But what's so weird to talk to, is it Nilly? I don't know if I'm saying that right. But to your point, a lot of these jobs are actually paying more than the general, like the jobs that were for PhDs. I find a lot of the ones, especially for police, they want to do hotspots police stuff. And they want to pay $90,000, $95,000, $100,000. And so that's why it's really confusing to me that they're asking for lower work. I like Shannon's perspective that it might actually be about some equality thing. I still feel like my conspiracy is right, that they want a less good researcher. That's why they're doing it, because they want someone that's going to support their views. But
so here's what I would say to you. Most law enforcement agencies are union shops, right? They have a union. The union forces them to allow for existing people to apply for the job. That doesn't mean that they have to give it to them, but they have to make the job available because it is a $90,000 job and it is a class job that's at the desk that a law enforcement officer who is on desk duty due to injury or whatever has the capacity to apply for it without having to get a PhD. So this is why you see that in law, like you don't see it in Department of Corrections, for example, in many places, because administrative jobs are not union jobs. Once you put a PhD on it and you put a list on it, it's not a union job anymore. And it's not available to union members. So I would not shy away. The other thing with policing is the field, right? So criminology, if you think about it, there's less applied. So there's applied work and organizations or academic organizations that do some work in policing, and that there are people who worked in the field and moved up, like, and got like academic jobs, but there aren't that many. And most of the policing stuff is theoretical. And so they're, right, you think of all the law enforcement agencies, and if they limit it to PhDs, they're wasting their time going through the application process, pushing it out there, marketing it, and they're not going to get a whole lot of applicants. And so they're just net casting pretty wide to hope that if a PhD doesn't apply, they're going to get someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree.
So I wouldn't conspiracy theory that one, although depending on which organization it may be, right? It may be that they got a BJA grant and they want data and they want to produce something, or they've got someone who's told them. That's what I see also, is someone will say, look, hotspot policing is important. You need to get a researcher. And then they take someone else's someone else's job description, and they just put their name on it and post it and don't really know what any of those words mean.
Yeah.
That really does explain a lot to me, because it's just when they talk about the qualifications versus like the rigor that hotspots policing research takes, like that's really difficult research. You have to have a lot of background in demography and, heavy quant stuff. So
you don't have to. You can do it shitty without any of that.
Well, yeah, it's really easy to do bad.
Let's be clear. You don't have to. What you need to explain in that interview is how you can do it better, and not in a academic posh way of like lofty, but actually like how you can help them. Because at the end of the day, what they want is, they don't know what they want. That's the problem. They've just heard these buzzwords about, oh, that's what we need to do, but they don't really know what that means. And so making sure that you're able to translate that to them and help them see what the benefits of that stuff is and what the problems are if you do it wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big, huge benefit for law enforcement agencies.
Well, so then to kind of take that a step further, then thinking more generally then about someone who's done a lot of hiring, when you've done hiring across your spaces at UC, at Harris, at JSP, and somebody really like hits it out of the park in their interview, what is it that they're doing, or how is it that they're talking about themselves that is convincing or tells you this person's got it?
No problem, David. We'll get to David wrote, I have a question, and sorry if the caps were on. Like, why are you yelling your question at me, David? I think this is a setup question, because what gets you the job is taking the interview in a parking lot in between two trucks.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so no one knows this, I guess. I took my job interview for JSP in the back of a rental SUV coming home from a contracting job in Delaware, trying to position my physical car between two semi trucks so that it would block the sun. And then the sun went down and it was too dark to do the interview. And I'm trying to turn the lights on in the car and then reposition myself in the interview so that like the backseat lights were on my face. It was interesting.
That's like, we knew that Shan was the right person when she was able to, but no, like, to all seriousness, I think it matters in the job, right? Like, for some people, it's right, like, for, to Lily, your point earlier, like, it's a sheriff's department. That's an elected official, right? And your ability to support their work, and this is hard. Like, look, like, don't get me wrong. Like, this is not an easy thing. And probably one of the reasons I love my position is because my findings can be my findings. Like, I don't work for a Department of Corrections where if you find something not so good, it's not getting published and you're not able to put your name on it, and you can't publish it because you work at X facility, and they're going to, like, even if you say a big Midwest town, well, let's see, how does that work? They work for Hamilton County and they're publishing about a Midwest town. I wonder if that's their agency, right? Like, These are elected officials. No one wants to lose their job, and they want to know stuff. They want to know where things are problematic, but they also don't want to read about it on the front of the paper. And so one of the things in applied work that does have to happen is you have to have a balance between like the politics of stuff, especially in today's world with kind of the cancel stuff. It's like one bad sentence, right? One sentence that can be taken out of context can cost someone their position, including yours. And so I do think you have to be really careful and run traps, right? Make sure that you have all the answers. I can tell you right now, I did. So there was an interview at one point in time. Hold on. Let me look who's in the room. All right, we're safe. There was an interview at one point in time where I gave the person a data set and they said, run me the data here, answer these 2 questions. You got 3 hours. It was all labeled out well. It was all organized. So you have 3 hours and then you have 30 minutes to put together a presentation and present to me the results. And they framed this as, it was amazing. Like they basically said, holy shit, I can't believe, is this real data? And I said, yeah, it's real data. It's obfuscated and you don't have real names, but it's real data. Oh my God, what's going on? Like 82% of the probation department is women, like people on supervision. And went on, and like I tried to give her feedback right away, but she went on to say, give me all the reasons why the probation department might be serving 82% women. It never dawned on her that she coded it backwards. And there was 82% men. And so one of the things I would say is when you are looking at data and when you're applying for jobs, but when you're in jobs as well, is if it sounds really ridiculous, it probably is. And so what you should do, the worst thing I ever did, I presented data to Franklin County. So I did a jail study on predicting population size within the jail. And the sheriff in Franklin County, Ohio, wanted to build a new jail. And my findings suggested they didn't need to build a new jail. Now, their jail was in shitty shape, and so they needed to do something, but they didn't need 550 more beds. And I had one data point on one slide in a 37-slide presentation that was wrong and made no sense. And he discredited my entire presentation for that one data point and said, well, if you screwed this up, you don't know what you're talking about, and walked out of the room. And like, it's hard to recover from that, right? And I recovered by the fact that I tracked their jail population for the next 15 years. Every year, I public requested their data and like sent them a note saying, look, my prediction was within 42 people this year. And I kept sending them notes saying, yeah, you didn't like my prediction, but it's actually come out to be pretty good. So I've got my kind of piece back. David, your thoughts, question.
So my question, I'm coming from a point of view of the imposter syndrome, more like the insecure. I felt like I'm in my 8th year recently, like 1 month before the COVID, I got my first, I'm writing my dissertation. I get my first full-time decent job in a city agency. And I'm very happy about it. And it's a research team of about, there is space for mentorship. And I did the interviews well. Obviously, I got the job. And I've been very happy, and I'm grateful to have a job in this situation. But it kind of, at the beginning, I thought I was checking all the boxes. So if Dr. Lovins, it took him 10 years, I'm okay. I still have hope and that. But then you mentioned about, people that don't survive. And I know COVID has been strange. What are the things you look for when you hire somebody that you say, well, this is not a match, okay? This person knows logistic regression, can do models and can make all these things, but he doesn't understand our data and I tell you why I come, like, obviously, everybody here knows the imposter syndrome at some point, have known the imposter syndrome, but I feel like I've been used by my team more and more just as an assistant, like clean this data set for me, don't. And actually I feel that my strength is on the other, the more academic side of things. I could do more things. I'm not, cleaning the data may not be, I know everybody has clean data, but so I'm worried about what you said about that. Like how do you know you're doing well when you're following these steps in these times precisely?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on who your boss is, right? And I know that's such to earlier comments of Lily, like, having a bunch of caveats to stuff. Like if you, I would like to believe that if you worked for me, you'd know where you stand, because that's important to me, that people know where they stand and whether they're doing a good job or not. Not all bosses are that way, and not all bosses are honest with employees. I hate to say, like, you would wish they would, but they're conflict, avoiders. They don't like people feeling bad, so they just give them stuff to do that kind of fills the gap. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's why they're giving you the stuff to do either, right? It's like, so I think there's a couple of things that I would probably recommend. One is I always recommend just being honest with people and supervising up and having a conversation about your passion and your interest and what you can bring. And I always believe I'd rather know where I stand than be worried about it every day. And so I'm pretty honest with folks and say, look, like, this is this and that. The second one I would say is the beauty of non or alt academic work is that if it's not a good fit, there are other opportunities. I know COVID-19 creates that space that's harder, but it also opens that space, because one of the things that I struggle with lots of agencies is that they, especially on the research side, they made you move to that location, right? So it's like, you can hire an academician or you can hire a researcher anywhere in the country. Everything we do can be predominantly done either by flying in for a minute or, right, looking at data from afar. And I think the COVID world has opened people's eyes that finding people in different geographic spaces is okay, and that we can hire people if I don't have a local place. So I think that, and so keeping in mind that there's always that. I think what most employers want is employees to do a good job and and enjoy their work. And so I think I would start conversations in ways, and we can definitely talk more about that if you want to reach out. Like, I can kind of help mentor and think through like how to have that conversation. I'd need to know more about your organization, your boss, to really kind of lean in and give you some like sage kind of recommendations. But I do think being honest with people, recognizing that if it's not what you want to do, start looking now before it gets too bad, because then you just jump to whatever position. You're in a position of leaving because you have to and you just can't take it anymore, and then you take the next position that's not a good fit for you. The other thing I would highly recommend, and we really tried, fair enough, and we may not have done it well, but with Shannon and Jen and hiring both of them, I think we talked about what we wanted, but we also listened about what they wanted. And as an employer, I was choosing them as much as they were choosing us. And I think sometimes as employees or as applicants, we don't think about that. We like, if we get the job, that's great. And the reality is then you're miserable the day after you get it. And so I would start thinking about, like, what is it I want to do? And let's find ways to do that. So so I'll give you a kind of, and I know we're getting close, I'll give you 3 places where I think from the applied world are incredible opportunities moving forward that you'd have to develop your space a little bit and push through. But I think there's going to be a wide open place. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So DEI work in all sorts of different ways are going to be incredibly important as the criminal justice system faces the disparate impacts that they have on people of color and women. And being able to do work that contextualizes it, doesn't call people racists, and blow them up and just tell them to cancel what they're doing, and actually helps them iterate and figure out ways to hear that their practice, right? Because I really truly believe that 80–85% of the people are doing what they do in their best interest, or not in their best, but in the people's best interest. They just don't know. They're not like, so when we do things in our best interest, we think we're doing great work. And they don't know that what they're doing is problematic. And so DEI stuff, incredibly important across the board. Corrections, policing, anything. The second one is district attorney work. There is a huge gap in applied research with district attorneys. It is probably the least researched group of people. There isn't much theory. There isn't much practice. What they do behind the scenes and how they make decisions and who they make decisions with and how and what they take into consideration. All of that stuff is gaps. And remember that in almost every single place, a district attorney is an elected official. And so it doesn't mean they know how to look at data. Didn't mean that they know how to run an organization. And so that space, if it's interesting to you, is one that is going to be an incredibly, I think over the next 10 years, a space where there is going to be an incredible amount of work to be done. The third one is thinking about, and we've started to think about this at JSP, is creating a research consortium that connects 4 and 5 and 6 small departments who don't have money to hire a full-time PhD person, and getting them to work together to hire a full-time position, right? So it's not one agency that has to try to come up with 60, 70, 80, 90, $100,000. It's 6 agencies having to come up with 15. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot easier. And you serve a purpose. So there's 3 counties, for example, in Texas that pooled their money together and created a position that is a shared researcher across the 3. And so I think rural, small organizations who do not have the capacity and hanging up a shingle, if you will, around like, we can be an embedded researcher for you and other people. And so understanding how small organizations with little data can see and get part of the piece as well. Mm-hmm. But David, I'll put my email in. If you want to send me an email, I'm happy to
thank you, Doctor.
Take this line off, take the conversation offline and talk through. And I can't promise you anything, but
all right.
Well,
and the 3 developing fields, just to recap, in the district attorneys offices in the next few years, issues of diversity and small.
Yeah.
And thinking through research consortiums.
Yeah, and trying to figure out how you can bring smaller agencies together to create, a space for them to also understand and be able to look at data.
Yeah. Well, I know that we're running really short on time, and I know you got to probably take the boys to some kind of sporting practice of sorts.
Baseball at 6.
And so a couple things that I just want to recap for everyone. And there's one little last question that's so big, but you're gonna have to say it in like a sentence or less. So one of the things I heard through all of this is the journey is not linear, and to lean into a non-linear journey, right? That it doesn't, like, you don't have to, what's prescribed to you or the check boxing, right? Like, you can do whatever you need to do. You can do whatever you need to do or want to do, like, let yourself lean with where it's going while also straddling the university setting, right? You can be in both spaces at once. You don't ever have to pick. I think also to add on to David's question that he asked is, like, for us, as students, the things we need to be thinking through are how we develop work that's grounded truly in practice, thinking through how we can translate that work in a way that's visual and understandable, but in a way that also is constantly adding value. So one of the things you said earlier that I think we didn't really circle back to, but I think also helps answer David's question about imposter syndrome when you're in your job, is as you're doing a project, that you are iterating 3 projects off of that one project, and you're telling your boss or your other folks, like, we're going to do this, but I already see 3 things we can pump out of this one thing we're already doing. And so adding value to yourself in those ways. But the thing that I also hear that I think is so important to your story is this conversation about thinking broader and bigger and more thoughtfully. And one of the 2 things that you said when you look back on your career, about, you say things that you, like, maybe did wrong, but I don't think it's wrong. I think it's just on the other end of what you know now, you just are able to be more honest about who you were as an academic, and you were bounded by what you knew in those moments, right? And so giving ourselves permission to say that our research came from doing status quo research, from positionality, from the bounded by the experiences we had at the time. And now thinking more deeply about the outcomes we're using. So you use risk versus success, right? How we frame the language, what that means. And we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So how do we take an equity lens to these structures? I know we've been talking about at JSP a lot in pretrial detention. And I'm hopeful we start talking about equity as it relates to probation more seriously. And so how do we encourage students to be super creative in their thinking? How do we encourage students to not just replicate our mentors' work, right? Which is, I think, one of the legacies our mentors want to leave behind. And how do we give students permission to really be as creative as fuck with their PhDs, that allowing them to do whatever the hell they want and turn it into whatever they want, and just do it from a space that is informed?
Oh, that question.
Yeah. How do we do that?
I think, so I got rid of the word should a long time ago out of my vocabulary, right? Because I feel like should always boxes us into something. I should be, I shouldn't do, I should be able to, right? It's a terrible, terrible word that limits our flexibility and our thinking about stuff. And so the first thing I would do is, the only thing that limits you is your thinking about it and your kind of structure. So I don't actually say, like, I've gotten rid of the saying, think outside the box. And I tell people they need to expand their box of thinking, right? Because it should be within your bailiwick to do these things, not outside of it. And so I think, and I think there are people that are more creative than others. I think you can learn some of that stuff and learn on ways to do it. But I do think that, so a couple kind of closing points to this. One, you have an incredible opportunity to do your passion, right? Whatever that is. And I'm assuming it's corrections or criminal justice or systems work or changing stuff or just learning or understanding. And for some of you, it might just be data, right? It doesn't really matter the subject. It's just, I love data and I love kind of digging in and understand. Like, do your passion, find ways to do that. And I think then it expands your opportunities. Second one that my mentor always says, which I thought was super important, is you can't be you can't be turned down for a job until you apply for it. Right. So I always say, like, well, what about this? And he said, go for it. Like, the worst they can do is say no. But if you don't apply for it, you can't get it turned down. And so if you're not sure about it, apply for it, get it. And if you don't want it, don't take it. So I think that was an important piece. And I think really, like, and I still believe this, like, do an incredible job of where you are. And that gives you, like, do your best work from where you are, and don't worry about where you are supposed to be or where you should be. And what that does is it opens all sorts of doors for you, because people love people who love their job. And when I hire someone, I ask them a couple questions. I know, and I hate to say this, but I know within 5 minutes if they're not going to get hired. I don't know till later on if they're the one that are going to get hired, but I could end most conversation in 5 minutes and tell you I'm not going to hire that person because they're not passionate, energetic, excited about their work. And I don't mean like bombastic and out here, but that when they talk about their work, they don't talk about it in a way that has energy and passion. And I think that's an important feature.
Awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining us, and importantly, allowing me to spend my workday doing this. But you know, we're so fortunate to have you. I know Jen and I are fortunate to have you. You're an incredible resource, and for others here, Brian's an incredible resource. He put his email in the chat function should you want to reach out, and we're so thankful for you spending time with us, for your sage advice, for talking us through it, for giving us permission to be creative and to challenge the status quo and force our spaces to give us bigger boxes instead of forcing us to think outside of them. And so we're really grateful that you spent some time with us and that we were able to learn from you today. With that, if you have any other questions for Brian, feel free to send me an email, or you can send it directly to him, and we can help answer some of those lingering questions that you had if we weren't able to answer them today. And with that, I will see you all next for our next session. The next session will be in 2 weeks. You'll receive a flyer and an email invitation. We'll be hosting Zach Drake. He's currently a research associate at Reuters, but he's worked with Booz Allen and Deloitte, and so he's going to talk us through what it's like to do research in true Big Four consulting firms and what it looks like in those spaces. So we're eager to talk to him, but thank you again, Brian, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Bye.